records disappear. That is the nature of atrocity. Those who commit it rarely wish to be remembered. And so they burn, they bury, they revise. But sometimes something survives. Sometimes a single document endures long enough to force the world to look at what it would rather forget. And sometimes what survives is more disturbing than the absence ever was. Sometime in the 1870s, a ledger was recovered from the ruins of a collapsed storage building on the grounds of the former Harwell Plantation in Census Parish, Louisiana. The ledger had belonged to the plantation's owner, a man named Gideon Harwell, who had managed that land through the final brutal decades before emancipation. The book itself was unremarkable, cloth-bound, water-warped, its pages brown at the edges. What was inside, however, was not unremarkable at all. The ledger contained names, hundreds of names. This was not unusual for plantation records. What was unusual was this. Some of those names belonged to people who had died years, sometimes decades before the dates beside their entries. And some belonged to people who, according to every other surviving record, had never existed at all. Who were they? Why were they there? And what did Gideon Harwell know that he never told anyone? That question would haunt a small corner of Louisiana for the better part of 40 years before someone finally came close enough to the truth that the truth became unavoidable. Before we continue with the story of the Harwell ledger and the names that should not have been there, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the perfect time. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments where are you watching from. What city or state are you in right now? We love hearing from you. Now, let's go back to Louisiana and let's find out what Gideon Harwell was hiding. Census Parish sits in the far northeastern corner of Louisiana, pressed against the Mississippi River's older channels, bayous wide and slow as sleeping animals draped with cypress and Spanish moss, so thick it filters the light into something amber and diffuse something that makes after afternoon feel like late evening and late evening feel like something without a name. The land is flat and wet and ancient, and in the years before the war, it was cotton country. Some of the most productive, and therefore some of the most relentless, in the entire South. The Harwell Plantation was established in 1831 by Gideon Harwell's father, a Virginian man named Archibald Harwell, who had come west with capital ambition and the particular moral convenience that allowed men of his class and era to look past what it cost in human terms to make that capital multiply. Archibald cleared land, drained swamps, built the principal house, a 2-story frame structure, white painted with a wide gallery across the front, and by the time he died in 1849, he had turned a muddy Census Parish tract into one of the wealthiest single planting operations in northeastern Louisiana. His son, Gideon, inherited everything at the age of 26. He was not the man his father had been, and most people who knew both of them said so with some frequency, though they rarely clarified precisely what they meant. Archibald had been forceful, sociable, the kind of man who presided over a dining table with the comfortable authority of someone who genuinely believed the world had been arranged for his benefit. Gideon was quieter. He had studied for 2 years at the College of William and Mary before illness brought him home, and he had returned with a quality his neighbors found faintly unsettling. Not cruelty, not exactly, and not weakness either, but a kind of careful attention that expressed itself in silence where another man might have spoken. He watched, he recorded, he kept accounts. That habit of recording would outlast him by decades and eventually undo everything he had spent his life constructing. The plantation ran through the 1850s. At the peak of its operation, ginning somewhere between 300 and 400 bales of cotton per season, with an enslaved workforce that Gideon maintained at around 120 people. He was known in the parish as a careful manager, rather than a violent one, which in that context meant only that documented incidents of extreme punishment were less frequent on his land than on some of his neighbors. The ledger he kept was meticulous. Every name, every age, as best as could be estimated, every assignment, every acquisition, every death. It was that last column, the column that tracked deaths, that would eventually become the thing no one could explain. The ledger was not discovered cleanly or dramatically. There was no single moment of revelation, no scholar lifting a pristine volume from a forgotten chest. The reality was messier than that, and messier things tend to be more credible. The storage building that housed it had been part of the original plantation complex, a low-slung timber structure used in its working life for storing tools, seed stock, and various overflow goods that had nowhere better to go. After the war, after emancipation, after the Harwell family's fortunes collapsed with the speed and totality that tended to characterize the ending of a system that had been entirely dependent on stolen labor, the building fell into disuse. The main house changed hands twice between 1866 and 1872, and was eventually purchased by a northern-born cotton factor named Bernard Oakes, who intended to continue working the land on a sharecropping basis and needed to assess what infrastructure he'd bought. In the summer of 1873, while Oakes's workers were clearing and inventorying the outbuildings, one of the storage structure's interior support beams failed, bringing part of the roof down. No one was seriously hurt. When the debris was sorted through, a tin box was found wedged beneath the collapsed beam, apparently thrown from a shelf above, and protected from the full weight of the fallen timber by the angle of its landing. Inside the tin box were 3 items: a worn leather wallet containing nothing, a sheath of letters tied with cord, and the ledger. Oakes, being a practical man and not particularly interested in the record-keeping habits of former slaveholders, set the tin box and its contents aside in the main house. The letters were written in a hand he found difficult to read and addressed to a woman whose name he did not recognize. He meant to have someone look through them eventually. He did not, in fact, ever do so. It was his wife, a Massachusetts woman named Clara Oakes, who first actually read the ledger. She did so on a rainy October afternoon in 1873 with no particular purpose in mind beyond curiosity and the restless energy of a woman confined indoors. She began at the front where Gideon Harwell had recorded his initial inventory of the property he had inherited, and she read forward chronologically. She read for approximately 2 hours. Then she set the ledger down on the parlor table, went to the window, and stood looking out at the bayou for a long time without moving. What she had found was this. Near the middle of the ledger, in entries that covered the period between roughly 1851 and 1857, names appeared in the deceased column that Clara recognized from earlier sections of the same book. Not the same names in the way that common names recur across a population. The same names, the same ages, the same descriptive notations that Harwell had used to distinguish individuals. A man listed as tall, marked left cheek. A woman noted as speak French, good with children. A child described simply as boy 7 purchased Nacho to March 1844. All 3 had been recorded as dead. The man in 1848, the woman in 1847, the child in 1846. All 3 appeared again in the 1851 to 1857 sections of the ledger, alive, assigned to fieldwork or domestic duties, with small notations beside their names that Clara could not immediately interpret. She told her husband that evening. Bernard Oakes was a methodical man, and his first instinct was the most rational one. Clerical error. Harwell had made mistakes, confused names, duplicated entries. It was the kind of thing that happened in large handwritten records maintained over many years by a single person without institutional oversight. This explanation satisfied him entirely and almost satisfied his wife. Almost because there was something else in the ledger, something smaller, stranger, that she had not mentioned to Bernard yet, and would not mention for several weeks. Tucked between 2 pages near the back of the book, written not in Harwell's careful copper plate, but in a different hand, cramped and slightly uneven, as though written quickly or under some form of pressure, was a single sentence. "They are not the same ones." That was all. 5 words in someone else's handwriting, slipped between the pages of Gideon Harwell's ledger sometime before or after the ledger was sealed in its tin box, and left there. Clara Oakes did not sleep well that October. The sentence rotated in her mind the way that certain phrases do when they attach themselves to a question you cannot stop asking. They are not the same ones. Not the same ones as what? Not the same as the people recorded under those names earlier in the ledger. If so, who was writing the note? And to whom and why? Why would someone feel the need to clarify in writing hidden within the document itself that the living people bore the same names as the dead? She wrote a letter to her brother in Boston, a man named Thomas Garrett, who taught history at a small college there and had a particular interest in the record-keeping practices of the Antebellum South. She did not describe the note. She described only the duplicate names and asked whether he had encountered similar phenomena in plantation records. Thomas Garrett wrote back in 3 weeks. He had, he said, heard of deliberate name falsification in plantation records, usually for purposes of tax avoidance or the concealment of illegal slave trading. He had also heard of clerical error producing apparent duplications. He had not, he said, encountered a case where the same descriptive identifiers, the physical markings, the noted skills, the documented origins were applied consistently to both the dead and the living entries. That, he said, was unusual. He said he would like to see the ledger. Thomas Garrett arrived in Census Parish in the spring of 1874. He was 41 years old, a lean, precise man with spectacles that he was constantly removing and replacing, and a habit of taking small, rapid notes in a pocket-sized book he carried everywhere. He had spent the previous 15 years studying the documentary history of American slavery, not from any particular political motivation, he would have said, but from what he called the historian's fundamental obligation to the evidentiary record. He believed that the past could be known if one was willing to be rigorous, and he was rigorous. He spent his first day at the Oaks Plantation, simply reading the ledger from cover to cover, speaking very little, and eating lunch at the parlor table without appearing to notice what he was eating. Clara watched him read with the particular attention of someone who has been carrying a private anxiety and is hoping someone else will either validate or dismiss it. By evening, Thomas had filled 11 pages of his small notebook. "It is not clerical error," he said at dinner. He said it without preamble, as though continuing a conversation already in progress, which in his mind it apparently was. The duplicate entries are too consistent. A clerical error produces inconsistency. A name repeated with different ages, different physical descriptions. What we have here is the opposite. The same person as described, appearing as deceased, and then appearing again alive under circumstances that suggest Harwell was aware of the duplication and was not troubled by it. Why would a man not be troubled by recording a dead person as alive? Bernard Oakes asked. That is precisely what I intend to find out. Thomas said he stayed for 6 weeks that spring. He went through every document in the tin box, including the letters, which turned out to be from Gideon Harwell to a woman in Natchez, Mississippi. a correspondence that shed some light on Harwell's character and personal life, but nothing immediately relevant to the ledger's anomalies. He spoke to as many people in the parish as he could find who had any memory of the Harwell plantation during its operating years. This was more complicated than it sounds. The people most likely to know what had actually happened on that land were the people who had been enslaved there, and they were not necessarily inclined to speak freely to a northern white man who showed up with a notebook and a lot of questions. Thomas was aware of this. He was, for a man of his era and background, unusually aware of it. He hired as an intermediary a man named Robert Dufer, a freeborn Creole man of color who had lived in Census Parish his entire life and had an extensive network of relationships across the parish's black community. Robert was 48 years old, had worked as a barber, then a school teacher, then a political organizer during Reconstruction's brief and increasingly dangerous flowering, and he regarded Thomas Garrett with the careful, assessing attention of someone who has learned through long experience to take the full measure of a stranger before deciding how much to trust him. They reached an understanding over the course of several days. Thomas wanted information. Robert wanted something more complex. He wanted whatever was true about the Harwell plantation to be written down correctly by someone with the means and the standing to make it matter. He had grown up hearing stories about Harwell. He had grown up knowing that something had happened there that people spoke of only obliquely in parts, in the way that communities sometimes encode their most difficult knowledge in fragments too small to be seized and too persistent to be lost. What Robert told Thomas in those early spring weeks was enough to keep Thomas Garrett in Louisiana for the better part of the next 4 years. The story that Robert Dufour carried, assembled from years of listening, from the recollections of older people in the parish who had been children or young adults during the Harwell years, from fragments of conversation and deliberate silences, and the particular weight that certain names carried when they were spoken, was not a single story. It was several stories that overlapped at their edges, like the rings of a felled tree, each one containing something the others did not. The oldest layer of the story began around 1848 or 1849, which Thomas noted was precisely the period corresponding to the first anomalous entries in the ledger, the earliest deaths that would later be echoed by living entries bearing the same names and descriptions. In that period, according to the oldest and most fragmented accounts, several people on the Harwell plantation had been sold not to nearby plantations, not to the casual lateral transfers that were common in the Cotton Belt, but sold away south and west in the direction of the New Orleans markets and the deep trade routes that fed them, sold so completely that no one who knew them ever heard from them again. This was not in itself unusual. It was a horror common enough to be ordinary in that world. What gave the accounts their particular texture was the insistence in several separate testimonies collected by Robert and Thomas independently that the sales had been concealed, that Gideon Harwell had told the people remaining on the plantation that those sold were dead. He told them the fever took them. One elderly woman named Dorotha said she was in her late 60s, had been born on the Harwell plantation, and spent her entire girlhood and young womanhood there. She spoke to Robert in Creole French, which Robert translated for Thomas. As they walked, he told everybody they passed from the fever in the same week, all 4 of them. Same week in July. "Do you believe that?" Robert had asked her. Dorotha had looked at him with an expression that Robert described to Thomas as patience applied with some deliberate force. "I was 12 years old," she said. "My mother told me people who die from fever, you see them sick before they go. You see them carried, you hear them in the night. These four. One morning they were there, one morning they were not. If this was true, if Gideon Harwell had falsified deaths in the ledger to disguise sales he wanted to conceal, the first question was why selling enslaved people was legal, unremarkable, economically common. A man in Harwell's position would have had no practical reason to hide it, unless the sales themselves were somehow irregular. Thomas wrote that word in his notebook and circled it. Irregular. He needed more. What he got over the following weeks was less a cascade of revelation than a slow accumulation. Small pieces, each one almost nothing on its own, that began to form a shape he could half see and not quite name. A shape that he found to his own discomfort. More disturbing the clearer it became. He learned that Gideon Harwell had maintained a private account at a bank in Vidalia across the river in Concordia Parish, separate from the plantation accounts that his records reflected. A man who had worked as a clerk in that bank in the 1850s, now elderly and living in poverty in a Natchez rooming house, remembered Harwell visiting that account with a regularity that had seemed, even at the time, deliberate in its separation from his usual business. He learned that there had been during the 1850s a man who visited the Harwell plantation with some regularity, a man the enslaved community knew only as the counter because of his habit of walking the fields and the quarters with a small tally board counting, never speaking to anyone directly, always accompanied by Harwell himself. Nobody knew the counter's name. Nobody remembered his face with any precision, only his habit. He counted. He made marks. He left. And Thomas learned this from Robert, who had heard it from a man in his 70s named George, who had been a teenager on the Harwell plantation and was now one of the only surviving people, who had been old enough at the time to have formed real memories of what he witnessed. That there had been replacements. George told me Robert said one evening, with the gallery of the Oaks house with Bade going darm that were taken, not that died, taken. He made that very clear. Other people would arrive, not always right at times weeks later, sometimes months as the people would arrive. They would be given the same work assignments as the people who may have a while Harwell by the names of the people who had called out. Thomas was quiet for a moment. The same names. The same names. George said at first people thought it was a mistake or some kind of, he said. The word his mother used was a game that Harwell was playing, a game with names. But then it kept happening. And George said his mother told him he's keeping something in balance. She didn't know what, but she said he needs the numbers to look the same. He needs the book to say the same thing it said before. Thomas looked at his notebook. The word he had circled, irregular. He was beginning to understand the shape of what he was looking at. And he was beginning to wish he were not. What Thomas Garrett spent the next several months assembling with Robert Dufour's help and the cautious incremental cooperation of a community that had excellent reasons for wanting the truth known and fearing what telling it might cost them. What is the option that it required of a transaction so suspicions of corruption required the ledgers as falsifications as a structural component rather than an afterthought. Gideon Harwell had been selling people illegally. Not illegally in the sense of breaking the laws of his state. Louisiana's laws, like those of every slave state, provided no meaningful protection to enslaved people against sale, separation, or anything else illegally in the sense that he had been selling people he did not own. This required some explanation, and Thomas would spend years refining his understanding of the mechanism. But the essential structure was this. Harwell had entered into an arrangement sometime around 1848 or 1849 with a network of traders operating the internal slave trade between the Upper South and the Gulf Coast markets. The arrangement was not simple purchase and sale. It was something closer to what Thomas, searching for language adequate to it, eventually called a substitution scheme. Harwell would identify from his own population individuals who could be, in the cold actuarial language of that market, described as matching a particular profile, requested by buyers further south. He would arrange the sale of those individuals, record them as deceased in his ledger, and then acquire replacement individuals purchased quietly through channels that bypass the usual auction markets, whom he would install in the same roles and eventually assign the same names. The ledger, which the state tax authorities used as the basis for the property assessment of enslaved populations, would show no net change. No one looking at the records from outside would see a transaction at all. The money went to the private account in Vidalia. The full scope of what this meant, its scale, its duration, the number of people affected, Thomas could not determine with certainty from the surviving evidence. What he could establish was that it had been running for at least 6 years, possibly longer, and that the replacement individuals who appeared in the ledger under the names of the people who had been sold were themselves certainly obtained through the same network. Likely people displaced from other plantations through similar arrangements, their own histories and names and identities structure, wiped away and replaced with the administrative fictions that kept Harwell's books in order. The note, hidden in the legend. They are not the same ones took on a new dimension when understood in this context. Thomas had originally assumed it was written by someone external to the plantation, a clerk perhaps, or an auditor. He now believed it had been written by someone inside. Someone who knew exactly what the ledger's numbers represented and what they concealed. Someone who had written it not as an explanation, but as a testimony, a statement placed inside the document itself in the one place it might survive, even if everything else was destroyed. He spent considerable time trying to determine who had written it. The handwriting was not Harwell's. It was not any hand he could identify from the other documents in the tin box. It was, he eventually concluded, the handwriting of someone who had not been in the habit of writing. The letters were formed carefully, but with the slight imprecision of a person for whom the act of writing was not fully automatic. Someone who had learned to write but had not written often, in the 1850s on a Louisiana plantation. That description narrowed the field considerably, and not in the direction of white men with access to accounting ledgers. Thomas sat with that conclusion for a long time. Whoever had written those 5 words had understood what the ledger contained, had been close enough to it, physically close enough to have placed a note inside it, and had wanted, with the particular urgency of someone who knew they might not get another chance to leave a record, that what the numbers described was not the truth. They are not the same ones, not an accusation, not a plea, just a correction. The most minimal possible testimony against the most systematic possible erasure. Thomas Garrett was not a sentimental man by habit or by training. He noted in a letter to his sister written that fall that he had found himself staring at those 5 words for longer than he could reasonably account for. If this story is giving you chills, and we are only just getting into the full depth of what Thomas Garrett uncovered, share this video with someone who loves dark, true mysteries. Hit the like button to help us keep telling stories like this one, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Because what comes next, what Thomas found when he started pulling on the thread of that private account in Vidalia, is the part of this story that no one in Tensor's parish wanted to talk about. Let's keep going. The bank in Vidalia across the Mississippi from Natchez had been in operation since the early 1840s, under various names and ownership arrangements. In 1874, it was owned by a consortium of cotton factors and commission merchants, most of them relative newcomers to the region who had arrived after the war and regarded the institution primarily as a mechanism for managing the crop lien credit that now bound the sharecropping economy together. The records from its antebellum period were fragmentary at best. The bank had endured a fire in 1863, a period of military occupation, and 2 changes of ownership in quick succession, none of which had been conducive to archival preservation. What Thomas found there was not records exactly. What he found was a name. The account that Harwell had maintained, the private account, separate from the plantation's commercial activity, had been opened in conjunction with another account belonging to a man named Clement Yates. Thomas learned this not from any surviving bank document, but from the elderly former clerk he had tracked to Natchez, a man named Augustus who had worked at the Vidalia Institution from 1849 to 1858 and remembered certain transactions with the tenacious specificity that memory sometimes develops around things it found troubling. Augustus remembered Clement Yates because Yates had frightened him mildly, but persistently, throughout the years of their professional acquaintance. Yates was a factor, a middleman in the cotton trade who managed sales on commission and, as factors frequently did, extended credit to planters against future crop yields. He operated out of Natchez and traveled regularly through the river parishes on both sides of the Mississippi. He was in his late 50s during the period in question. A compact and precisely dressed man who spoke little and noted everything, and whose habit of arriving at the bank without advanced notice and conducting whatever business he had with an air of complete indifference to the presence of others had struck Augustus as the manner of a man who had long since ceased to expect scrutiny. Yates and Harwell had, in Augustus's recollection, conducted transactions together on at least 7 or 8 occasions over the period of his employment. He could not describe the nature of those transactions with any precision. The accounts themselves were the records, and the records were gone. But he described the manner of them. Cash primarily, not transfers, not instruments of credit, but actual specie and banknotes carried in the kind of leather cases that travelers used for valuables. Money arriving in Harwell's account from Yates's or from accounts that Yates managed as a factor, regular, predictable, like a salary, Augustus said, though he immediately corrected himself. Not like a salary, like a fee, like someone was paying for something specific and paying the agreed amount each time. Thomas wrote Clement Yates's name at the top of a clean page in his notebook and began working outward from it. Yates had died in 1869, which closed some avenues. But he had left behind a son, a daughter, and a business partner, a younger man named Frederick Hale, who had continued operating the factoring business after Yates's death, and who lived in 1874 in a large house on the outskirts of Natchez. Thomas called on Hale twice. Hale was polite both times in the way that people are polite when they are deciding how little to give you, while appearing cooperative. He confirmed that he had known Gideon Harwell, that Harwell had been a client of the Yates factoring business for many years, that their dealings had been entirely conventional in nature. He did not offer anything that was not directly responsive to a question, and he watched Thomas with the steady attention of someone tracking a threat. The second visit, Thomas brought Robert Dorr. This was a calculated decision. Natchez in 1874 was not a safe place for a black man to accompany a northern white man into the home of a prosperous former Confederate sympathizing businessman, and Thomas had thought about it carefully and offered Robert the choice. Robert had said yes without a great deal of deliberation, which Thomas later wrote he found both humbling and instructive. That Robert's willingness to take risks that Thomas himself would not have had to take was the kind of thing one noticed and did not entirely know what to do with. The effect of Robert's presence in Hale's parlor was interesting to observe. Hale became, if anything, more carefully controlled rather than less. He maintained the polished courtesy that wealth and long practice had given him. But something in his watching shifted. Thomas had been in his 2 previous visits a manageable quantity, a northern academic, annoying but ignorable. With Robert in the room, the social geometry changed in ways that seemed to make Hale less certain of his angles. Thomas had prepared for this visit differently than the first 2. He had the previous evening written out a precise description of what he believed he could establish about the arrangement between Harwell and Yates. Not everything, but enough. Enough to demonstrate that he understood the shape of the scheme. He read this description to Hale in a measured voice, watching Hale's face. Hale listened without expression. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence. "I was not involved," Hale said finally, "in whatever you are describing. I came into the business in 1862. Whatever arrangements Clement maintained before that time were his own." "I'm not suggesting you were involved," Thomas said, which was not entirely accurate. "I'm asking whether you know who else might have been, whether Clement Yates's network extended beyond his own accounts." Another silence. Hale looked at Robert for a moment, not with hostility exactly, but with the complicated attention of a man encountering something that didn't fit a category he found comfortable. Then he looked back at Thomas. "There was a man," Hale said. "I knew him only as an associate of Clemens. He operated further west, Texas. I think eventually he was in this region during the 50s. I don't know the full extent of his activities." He paused. "His name was Aldous Crane." Thomas wrote the name down. "What did Crane do?" "He facilitated," Hale said. The word came out with a kind of deliberate emptiness, as though Hale had chosen it specifically for its lack of substance. "Facilitated what?" Hale looked out the window at his garden. "He moved things," he said, "from one place to another, and he kept records of the movement, very precise records. He was known for that, for the precision." Thomas looked at Robert. Robert's expression did not change, but something in the stillness of it communicated something. A recognition, perhaps, that they had just found the edge of the territory they had been mapping toward. "Where are Crane's records now?" Thomas asked. Hale turned from the window. "I have no idea," he said. "And if I were you, Mr. Garrett, I would give considerable thought to whether you actually want to find them." Thomas Garrett spent the better part of a year trying to find Aldous Crane, or what remained of him. The search took him from Natchez to New Orleans, from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, and eventually to a small and diminishing settlement in East Texas called Garland's Crossing, where Crane had apparently spent the last years of his life in the condition of a man slowly divesting himself of everything he had accumulated. He died in April of 1871. He had been a widower with no surviving children, and he had died in the company of a woman who kept house for him and a neighbor who had come to check on him. When the housekeeper reported he was unwell, the neighbor, a farmer named Walter, was still alive when Thomas arrived in Garland's Crossing in the spring of 1875, and was willing to talk with the loose-tongued eagerness of someone who had been sitting on a story and had long since stopped expecting anyone to come ask about it. Crane had been, by Walter's account, a man who seemed to have been eaten from the inside by something he never named. He had arrived in Garland's Crossing around 1865 with enough money to buy a modest house and parcel of land and no apparent desire to do anything with either. He did not farm. He did not conduct business. He sat on his porch. He received occasionally letters from Louisiana and Mississippi that he burned after reading. He drank moderately but consistently in the way that people drink when the purpose is not pleasure, but maintenance. He was polite to his neighbors without ever becoming their friend, and he spoke about his past with the careful vagueness of a man who has decided that what he knows is not something the world should hear from him. But near the end, Walter said he had talked. Not to Walter. Walter was clear about that and seemed faintly wounded by the exclusion. But to a minister who came through Garland's Crossing twice a year, a Methodist circuit rider named Ephraim, who Walter described as a serious and somewhat severe man who had been moved for reasons Walter never fully understood to spend considerable time with Crane during his final decline. Ephraim was still circuit riding. Thomas found him in the fall of 1875 after a summer of letters and inquiries at a camp meeting in Henderson County, Texas. He was a thin man in his 50s with a voice that had acquired through years of outdoor preaching a quality of projected clarity that made casual conversation feel faintly theatrical. He was not, he told Thomas, willing to share anything that had been told to him under pastoral confidence. Thomas had expected this. He had prepared for it. He explained carefully what he was trying to establish and what he already knew, and what he believed the consequences of silence were in this particular case. He did not make threats. He made an argument. The argument was essentially this, that the people most harmed by what Crane had been involved in had no other avenue for any accounting, and that the details Thomas sought were not confessional secrets, but historical facts whose truth or falsehood did not depend on Crane's private remorse. Ephraim listened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He told me that he kept a ledger of his own." Thomas went very still. Crane kept his own records. He told me he kept a record of every transaction he facilitated, every name, every origin and destination. He said he kept it because he believed. Ephraim paused, choosing his words with visible care. He said he believed that the worst thing about what he had done was not the doing of it, but the forgetting of it. He said that the system he had served depended on forgetting. That the people he had moved through it were meant to disappear so completely that even they would eventually lose track of who they had been. He said the ledger was his way of, I am using his word here, contesting that he said he believed that as long as the names existed somewhere in some record, then the forgetting was not complete. Thomas said, "Where is the ledger?" Ephraim said he did not know. He had not seen it. Crane had described it, but not shown it to him. He had said it was in his possession, and that he had not decided what to do with it. After Crane died, his house was cleared by a county administrator. His modest estate, the house, the land, a small sum in a local bank, passed to a distant relative in Georgia, who never visited and sold the property within a year. What became of any papers or personal effects from the house, Ephraim did not know. Thomas went back to Garland's Crossing. He spent 3 weeks there searching every channel he could identify. He spoke to the woman who had kept house for Crane, an older woman named Mercy, who had survived Crane by 4 years and was now living with her daughter. Mercy remembered the ledger, not as a ledger. She had not known what it was, but as a book that Crane kept in a strong box under his bed, that he took out occasionally and read from for long periods, and that he handled with the precise care you give to something fragile and irreplaceable. The strong box was gone. The county administrator, Mercy said, had taken several boxes of Crane's belongings in settlement of minor debts. Some of those items had been sold at a public disposal. Others had been stored at the county office. Thomas went to the county office. The county clerk was a young man, barely out of boyhood, who had held the position for less than a year, and knew almost nothing about what had been stored, where, or for how long. But he let Thomas look through the storage room, a low and dusty space behind the main office that smelled of old paper and damp wood. Thomas spent 2 days in that room. On the second afternoon, in a wooden box pushed to the back of the lowest shelf, he found a small leather-bound ledger with a metal clasp. The clasp was corroded, but had held. The leather was darkened and stiff with age. On the inside front cover, in a hand, quite different from Gideon Harwell's copper plate, and different also from the cramped writing of the hidden note, was a name written in large, clear letters, Aldous Crane. His account of accounts. God forgive me. Thomas Garrett, read Aldous Crane's ledger in the county clerk's storage room over the course of the next 3 days, barely leaving except to sleep a few hours at the boarding house a quarter-mile away. The county clerk, who had understood by now that whatever Thomas had found mattered to someone, somewhere, hovered at the edge of curiosity, but did not interfere. What Crane had kept was in its technical form straightforward. A record of transactions, names, origins, destinations, dates, amounts. The names were the most important part. There were hundreds of them spanning from approximately 1843 to 1863. 20 years of what Crane had called, in the ledger's opening notation, his facilitated movements. But Crane had done something that Harwell had not done, or perhaps could not do, within the functional requirements of his own ledger. Crane had written beside many of the names, not all, but many brief notations that had no practical transactional purpose, notes about the people themselves, as much as he had been able to observe or was told. Ages, places of origin going further back than the immediate sale point. Family relationships where he knew them. A man who had been brought from Virginia originally, sold first in Richmond, then again in Charleston, then acquired by the network that Crane served and moved to Louisiana. A woman who had been born in Kentucky and had 2 children, whom she had not seen in 7 years. A child of 12 who spoke 3 languages because his first owner had been a French-speaking immigrant from Sandang. These notations were not extensive. They were the brief annotations of a man noting what he saw in the margins of transactions. He was recording for entirely different purposes, but they were there. And across the 20 years of the ledger's span, they accumulated into something that was not quite a portrait and not quite a testimony, but existed somewhere between the two. A partial record of people moving through a system designed to erase them, annotated by the man who had moved them, and who had apparently found by the time he was dying in a Texas house with no friends that the record had become the only honest thing he had left. The Harwell entries were there. Thomas found them on the 34th and 35th pages of the ledger, covering the period between 1848 and 1858. There were 19 names, 19 people described by Crane, with his brief notations recorded as having passed through whatever arrangement connected him to Harwell. Opposite each name in a separate column, Crane had written the destination, not the name of a person or a plantation, but a code, a series of letters and numbers that Thomas could not immediately decipher, and would spend the next several months attempting to decode. Of the 19 names, 8 appeared in Harwell's ledger as deceased. 8 of the people Crane had recorded as having been moved, removed, sold into the deeper south through channels that left no public trace were the same people whose deaths Harwell had fabricated in his own accounts to balance the books against what he had taken from them. And among those 8 was the brief notation in Crane's hand, beside a name Thomas did not yet know how to connect to the hidden note, spoke English and French, kept records for the house, understood what she read. Thomas sat with that for a long time, a woman who kept records for the house. Who understood what she read? Who had, if Thomas's understanding was correct, been close enough to Harwell's ledger to have slipped a note inside it? He looked again at the handwriting of those 5 words. They are not the same ones. The careful letters of someone who had learned to write but did not write often. A woman with access to the main house's records. A woman who understood what she read. A woman who, according to Crane's ledger, had been taken in 1849 and moved somewhere to some destination encoded in letters and numbers that Thomas had not yet resolved, and who had known before she was taken exactly what Harwell's ledger was hiding. She had written her testimony into the evidence, while she still could. Her name in Crane's ledger was listed simply as Ada. The code in Crane's destination column took Thomas 8 months to crack, and he did not do it alone. He sent copies of the column's entries to his brother-in-law in Philadelphia, a man who had worked during the war as a signal officer and had some experience with the ciphering systems used in commercial correspondence of the period. He sent another copy to a professor of mathematics at a small college in Ohio, who had corresponded with him about record-keeping practices. He himself worked through the entries systematically in the evenings, testing hypotheses, backtracking, starting again. What the code turned out to be was neither sophisticated nor elegant. It was the kind of cipher that emerges from practical necessity rather than mathematical ingenuity. A transposition system with a keyword that Thomas's brother-in-law eventually identified as the name of a town in Mississippi. Once the key was identified, the destinations resolved from letter-number combinations into place names, cities, towns, specific locations across Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and in several cases further south into the Gulf trade channels that connected the American domestic slave market to the Caribbean and beyond. The destinations confirmed what Thomas had theorized. The people who had passed through the Crane-Harwell network were not simply sold to other plantations in a straightforward domestic transaction. They were sold into a secondary market that deliberately complicated provenance. One that moved people through multiple transactions specifically to obscure their origins and make it effectively impossible for anyone searching for them to follow the trail. It was the same logic as the falsified deaths in Harwell's ledger. Every step of the process was designed to produce a clean break to make the person on one side of the transaction unrecognizable as having any connection to the person on the other side. For ADA, the destination entry resolved to a location Thomas recognized, a commission house in New Orleans on the far edge of the city's commercial district that had operated as a clearing house for the Gulf trade. By 1875, when Thomas decoded the entry, the commission house no longer existed. It had closed sometime during the war, and its building had since been occupied by a dry goods operation. Whatever records it had maintained were almost certainly gone. Thomas went to New Orleans anyway. He spent 3 weeks there in the winter of 1876, working through the city's surviving commercial records, its church registers, its property files. New Orleans in 1876 was a city in the particular exhaustion of Reconstruction's fading, politically volatile, economically stressed, haunted in ways that expressed themselves differently in different parts of the city, but were present everywhere. Thomas moved through it with the carefully maintained inconspicuousness of someone who had learned that being noticed in certain neighborhoods consequences. He was not prepared to absorb. He did not find Ada. He had not expected to find her living. The decades made that impossible. But he had hoped for a trace, some record that could tell him where she had gone from the commission house. What had happened to her? He found nothing that he could definitively connect to her. This was not surprising. The system had been designed to produce exactly this kind of silence. But he found something else in the commission houses' neighborhood, in the back room of a church that had served the city's free black community since the 1830s and maintained its own registers of baptisms, marriages, and deaths with the careful independence of an institution that did not trust the city's official record-keeping. He found an entry from 1851, a woman listed as Ada, approximately 30 years of age, presented for baptism. Place of origin listed as Louisiana, North Parish. Status listed as enslaved. The notation beside the entry in the priest's handwriting said, "She asked that we keep her name. She said, 'If I am ever searched for, let there be a record that says I was here.'" Thomas read that sentence 3 times. Then he closed the register carefully and thanked the deacon who had let him look through it. And he walked out of the church into the December cold of a New Orleans afternoon and stood on the banquet for a long time, watching the street traffic move past him and thinking about a woman he had never met who had understood with complete clarity exactly what was being done to her and had responded, with every tool available to her, which were precisely to her literacy and her foresight. She had written a note in a ledger. She had asked a priest to keep her name in a record. She had, as much as any person in her situation could, contested the erasure. Whether it had protected her, Thomas did not know. Whether she had lived to old age or died young, in what conditions, with what quality of life, he could not determine. He had only the 2 traces, the hidden note and the baptism entry. Everything else was what the system had always intended, silence. Thomas returned to Census Parish in the spring of 1876, having been largely absent for nearly 2 years. He found Robert Duffer under a different kind of pressure than when he had left. Reconstruction was dissolving around them, not all at once, but in the way that a structure dissolves when the foundations are compromised, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The political conditions that had made certain kinds of inquiry possible, that had given men, like Robert, some degree of institutional protection, were eroding with every passing month. Robert was continuing his work as a teacher, but the school that had employed him was under pressure. His organizing activities had drawn notice from people who had the power to make notice expensive. They met at the Oaks House on a warm May evening, and Thomas laid out everything he had assembled, the full shape of it, as he understood it at that point. The Harwell ledger's falsified deaths, the private account in Vidalia, the connection to Clement Yates and Aldous Crane, the network of transactions that had moved people through a system designed to make them invisible, the 19 names in Crane's ledger that corresponded to Harwell's false death entries, Ada, the woman who had written the hidden note, and what Thomas had found of her in New Orleans. Robert listened without interrupting. His wife, a woman named Eugenia, who was considerably more openly skeptical of Thomas's enterprise than her husband, sat in the corner of the room, and also listened without interrupting, which Thomas had long since learned meant that she was thinking something that she had decided to defer rather than discard. When Thomas finished, Robert said, "What are you going to do with it?" Thomas had been thinking about this question for months. "Write it," he said. "Publish it. I have enough not to prove every element in a legal sense. There's no legal avenue worth pursuing. The people who could be charged are mostly dead, and the courts in this state." He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. But to make a documented historical record, to make it impossible for this to be simply forgotten, Eugenia said from the corner, "Who is going to read it?" Thomas looked at her. "Scholars, historians, people who study these records." "Who else?" He didn't answer because he understood what she was asking and didn't have a good answer for it. Eugenia said, "Those 19 people that were moved, their families, children, grandchildren, they're somewhere. Some of them are in this parish. Some of them are in Louisiana. If you publish a record that says what happened to those 19 people, where they came from, what their real names were, some of them might be able to trace family," Thomas said. "Yes," Eugenia said, "some of them might." She looked at him steadily. It was not a warm look exactly, but it was an honest one. "That matters more than you making a historical record," she said. "I'm not saying the record doesn't matter. I'm saying don't forget what actually matters." Thomas sat with that for a long time that evening. He had come to Louisiana as a historian. He had spent 3 years following a thread that had led him through falsified death records, private bank accounts, a dying man's confession to a circuit rider, and a single sentence in a church register in New Orleans. He had been thinking the whole time about what he could know and what he could establish and what the evidence could bear. He had been thinking like a man who works with documents and needs the documents to hold. Eugenia Dufour was pointing at something the documents could not fully reach. The living people connected to those 19 names. The people whose grandparents had been erased from Harwell's records and replaced with administrative fictions. The people who might, if given the information Thomas had assembled, be able to close some part of a gap that the system had made deliberately unbridgeable. The work was not finished. It had, in a sense, just changed shape. Over the following year, as Thomas worked on the written account that would eventually become a monograph privately printed in Boston in 1879, he and Robert pursued what Eugenia had named as the other purpose, identifying as best as possible the living connections to the people in Crane's ledger. This was harder than the documentary work and in some ways more painful. The deliberately severed connections that the scheme had created were not easily repaired by the discovery of their original existence. People who had built lives on the other side of those gaps, who had constructed family histories around absences, who had learned to live with not knowing, sometimes received the information Thomas had gathered with grief rather than relief, or with a complicated mixture of the two that didn't fit easily into any category. There were people who did not want to know. There were people who had known or suspected something of what had happened and had chosen silence as protection. There were family members who had spent decades believing that someone they loved had died, and for whom the news that the death had been fabricated, that the person had been taken alive, sold further south, was not comfort, but a new wound reopening on top of an old scar. Thomas wrote about this with a care that distinguished his monograph when it appeared from the more detached academic treatments of similar subjects. He had gone to Louisiana as an evidential historian. He had learned over 4 years that evidence does not exist in a separate space from the people to whom it belongs, and that the pursuit of historical truth carries obligations that extend beyond the publication of findings. He documented 7 of the 19 cases with enough specificity to allow probable family identification. For 3 of those 7, Robert Dufour was able to establish through the networks of community knowledge that he had spent decades cultivating connections between the names in Crane's ledger and families living in tense parishes who had carried the knowledge of their own losses as long-standing grief and were able now to attach specific names and circumstances to that grief. Able now to attach specifics to that grief. This was not resolution. It could not be, but it was something. It was what Ada had apparently wanted when she wrote 5 words into the margin of a dead man's ledger and asked a priest to keep her name in a register. Not resolution, but continuity. not the reversal of what had been done, but the stubborn refusal of its intended completeness. The Harwell plantation itself had by 1876 changed beyond recognition. The main house burned in a fire of uncertain origin in 1877. Bernard Oakes's descendants would always maintain it was accidental. Certain people in the parish maintained a different view, without ever saying so directly. The land was partitioned and sold in small parcels over the following decade. By 1890, no structure remained from the original complex. The land was farmed by families, many of them black, who had no particular reason to know what had stood there before and what had happened on it. The storage building, where the tin box had been found, had been one of the first structures to come down in 1874, not long after Clara Oakes first opened the ledger that had been sealed inside it. Clara herself lived until 1909, outlasting her husband by many years. She kept Thomas Garrett's monograph on her shelf until she died, and she kept beside it in an envelope a copy she had made in her own handwriting of the 5 words written in the hidden note. They are not the same ones. She left both items to her daughter with a letter explaining what they were and where they had come from. The daughter kept them. The daughter's children kept them. Whether they survive today, whether the letter and the envelope and the copy of that handwritten sentence still exist somewhere in the possession of Clara Oakes's descendants, is not something the record can tell us. Thomas Garrett published his monograph in Boston in the spring of 1879 under the title Names and Accounting, a study in the falsification of plantation records in Census Parish, Louisiana 1848-1863. He sent copies to 27 people, primarily academic colleagues and librarians at institutions that maintained collections in American history. He received 11 responses. Most of them were polite and professionally interested. Several were cautious in ways that reflected the political climate of 1879, in which the brief and turbulent project of Reconstruction had ended, and the systems that had preceded it were in the process of reasserting themselves in reconfigured forms. No major publication reviewed the monograph. No newspaper ran a story about it. It did not produce the public reckoning Thomas had, in his more optimistic moments, imagined it might. This did not entirely surprise him. He had known by the time he finished writing it that he was working in a moment when the American appetite for accounting, for the kind of precise name documented reckoning with what slavery had actually been and the low point, and the ledger he'd been following had led him to truths that the country was the process decided and collectively and with considerable determination not to look on, with considering to look at. But the monograph existed. 83 copies of it were printed. They went into libraries, into private collections, into the hands of people who read them, and put them on shelves and eventually left them to their heirs. Whether any of those copies survive is a question of physical chance, of which buildings did or did not burn, which estates were sold and which preserved, which libraries thought to catalog a privately printed Boston monograph on Louisiana plantation records with enough care that it could be found later. The question of whether they survive is not the same as the question of whether what they contain matters. Robert Dufour was shot in 1878. He was walking home from a meeting at the school he had been working to keep open against increasing pressure. The shooting was attributed to an unknown assailant and was never investigated with any apparent seriousness. He was 52 years old. Eugenia outlived him by 31 years, dying in 1909, the same year as Clara Oakes, though they never met. She continued the school after Robert's death, finding funding where she could, teaching when there was no one else to do it, maintaining the patient and unflinching work of an institution that the world around her kept trying to close. 3 of her grandchildren became teachers. One became a lawyer. She left no written memoir of what she and Robert had done during the 1870s. But she left the school, and the school was still teaching when she died. And that was perhaps the more durable record. Gideon Harwell himself had died in 1869 in modest poverty on a rented room near Vicksburg. He died of pneumonia at the age of 56 alone, having outlasted the system that had made him wealthy by enough years to understand what the end of it meant for a man like him, but not long enough to see the full accounting of what he had built. Whether he knew in the long years between 1865 and 1869 that his ledger still existed, that the tin box had survived the collapse of the storage building, that the falsified records were intact and legible, is not known. Whether he thought about the note inside it, whether he knew it was there, or knew who had written it, is not known. Whether he thought about Ada is not known. The last record of Ada herself is the baptism entry in the New Orleans church register, dated 1851. After that date, in every surviving record that Thomas examined, she does not appear. This does not mean she disappeared. It means the records that held her did not survive, or were never made, or were made and do not survive or survive in collections that have not been searched with her name in mind. The gaps in the archive are not the same as the absence of the people who moved through it. Thomas Garrett spent the rest of his career at the Boston College teaching history and writing on the archival challenges of recovering the antebellum record. He lived until 1901 and is buried in a cemetery outside the city. His monograph is cited occasionally in academic works on Southern plantation records and is held in the collections of 2 university libraries and 1 state historical society. Whether those copies have been read in recent decades is again a question of physical chance meeting historical interest. He never found out what happened to Ada beyond that 1851 baptism entry. He wrote in the final pages of the monograph that this was the condition of the work he had undertaken, that it did not end with resolution, that it ended instead with partial knowledge, with the shape of the truth visible in outline, the details stubborn in their refusal to be fully recovered, and the honest accounting of what could and could not be known. He wrote, "The ledger told us what Harwell had tried to erase. The hidden note told us that someone at the moment of erasure had refused to let it stand without a record. What became of that person we cannot fully trace. But she was there. She understood what was being done. She wrote it down." That act of writing was itself a kind of insistence that the record, however incomplete, should not be entirely false. We owe her the continuation of that insistence, to look at what the documents contain, even when what they contain is a careful, deliberate lie, and to say as plainly as she said it, they are not the same ones. The Harwell ledger was eventually donated to a New Orleans archive by the estate of Bernard Oakes's grandchildren sometime around 1920. It was catalogued as Plantation Records, Census Parish, 19th century, and placed in storage. For decades, it sat in the archives collection without particular note, 1 volume among thousands in a facility that held more antebellum Louisiana plantation records than almost any institution in the country, and was perennially underfunded in its effort to process and describe them. Whether Thomas Garrett's monograph was known to the archivists who handled the ledger is not recorded. Whether anyone who examined the ledger in those years noticed the false death entries or noticed the hidden denote or connected either to the documented scheme that Thomas had spent 4 years tracing. This too is not recorded. The ledger remains. It is part of the archives collection. The handwriting on its pages, Gideon Harwell's careful copperplate, systematic and precise, recording debits and credits in a moral accounting that the columns themselves cannot contain, is still legible. The entries for people recorded as dead who were not dead are still there, still bearing the physical markings and notations that Harwell used to distinguish individuals. He was moving from one category to another, and tucked between two pages near the back of the volume in a hand that is careful and slightly imprecise and unmistakably not Harwell's are 5 words that have survived almost 125 years of boxes and storage rooms and building as unkind modifiers of parts of a foreign country to look closely that preferred not look too closely what its record too closely what its records look too closely contain. They are not the same ones. History does not ask to be believed. It asks only to be read. And the question that the Harwell ledger, with its 19 false deaths, its replacement names, its hidden testimony, leaves us with is not whether it is true. The question is simpler and harder than that. The question is whether we are willing to look at what is there in plain handwriting on pages that have waited longer than any of us has been alive for someone to notice that the record is not what it claims to be, and whether having noticed we are willing to say so. Ada said so with 5 words in someone else's ledger, at a moment when saying anything at all cost more than most of us will ever be asked to pay. The ledger is still there. This mystery shows us how the most devastating truths in history are not buried by fire or flood, but by the careful, deliberate, bureaucratic work of people who understood that a false record is more durable than a destroyed one, and how sometimes the only thing standing between that falsification and oblivion is a single person who understood what they were reading and refused to say nothing. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we have found the full truth of what happened in Census Parish, or is there still something in those ledger pages that has not been explained? Leave your comment below. If you want more stories like this one, stories that ask you to look closely at what history tried to hide, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that refuse to let go. We will see you in the next story.